Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be focusing on one single date, November 13th,
All right.
and we're going to see how much history we can pack into one day.
Sounds like a challenge.
Now, our source material for today is a little unusual.
Oh.
We're going to be looking at the Wikipedia page for November 13th, but it's in Arabic.
Okay, so we'll be seeing this date through a bit of a different lens. I like it.
Exactly. And you know what? It's amazing what you can find when you just sort of start digging. We're going to be looking at everything from a 4th century saint all the way to a 21st century terrorist attack.
Wow. That is quite a span.
Yeah. Makes you think, what happened on your birthday throughout history, you know?
That's a great question. We're going to cover a lot of ground today, centuries even. But some themes definitely pop up like, well, conflict. It seems like there's always a conflict going on somewhere.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Sadly. And I think a really good example of that, one that really stands out, is from the 1002.
Okay. What happened then?
Well, we have King Athelred the Unready. Remember him?
Oh, yeah. The not-so-prepared king.
Not so much. And he gets spooked. He's worried about a Danish invasion, so he does something pretty drastic. He orders the killing of every Dane in England.
Oh, wow. That's brutal. The St. Bryce's Day massacre, right?
Exactly. And it just shows you how, well, xenophobia and fear, they can be used. You know, they can be manipulated.
Absolutely. Exploited for political ends. Sadly, it happens over and over again.
Right. Okay, so let's jump ahead now. November 13th, 1918.
World War I.
World War I. A big day for the war. So much is happening. We've got Russia. Now they're under the Bolsheviks. And they decide to, they tear up a treaty. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk.
Big implications
Yeah.
there. That treaty had given them peace with the Central Powers, taking them out of the war.
Yeah. And on the same day, you have the Allied forces, and they were taking Constantinople.
The capital of the Ottoman Empire, the walls are closing in.
Another major power on the verge of collapse. Now, you got to think about that treaty for a sec. That Brest-Litovsk thing, it was a controversial move.
Oh, for sure. I mean, Lenin was under a lot of pressure. Many saw it as a betrayal of Russia's allies.
Absolutely. But then just a few years later, 1935, another November 13th, we're in Egypt now.
Mm-hmm.
And things are, they're boiling over.
Anti-colonial sentiment.
Big time. Major uprising against the British and actually against the Egyptian government, too. People were really unhappy with that 1930 constitution. They felt it gave way too much power to the king and just didn't allow for real democracy.
Right. So it was about more than just the British presence. It was about internal power struggles, too.
Exactly. The fight for self-determination, it rarely comes easy. Then fast forward again, this time to 1966. November 13th, we're in the Middle East, and we have the Battle of Samu.
Israel and Jordan.
Right. Now, this one was a reprisal raid by Israel. 3 Israeli soldiers had been killed by a landmine.
So tensions were already high.
Extremely high. It just shows you how volatile that whole region is. Even what seems like an isolated incident, a landmine, it can escalate quickly.
Absolutely. Tragic cycle of violence.
And sadly, the violence continues into the 21st century. We have the horrific Paris attacks on November 13th, 2015.
130 people dead, hundreds wounded. A terrible, coordinated terrorist attack.
Claimed by ISIS.
Yeah. And just that feeling of, vulnerability, that these attacks could happen anywhere.
And they did. 7 years later, another November 13th, a bombing in Istanbul, right on that busy Istiklal street.
6 people killed, so many more injured.
That attack was attributed to Kurdish separatists.
It highlights that ongoing struggle for peace and stability in the region. So many layers of conflict.
So much complexity. Okay, but it's not all conflict. November 13th also saw moments where, maybe peace had a chance.
Oh, that's good to hear. Tell me more.
Okay, so 1974, November 13th, Yasser Arafat, the chairman of the PLO.
Yes, of course.
He addressed the UN.
Wow, a historic moment for the Palestinian cause. What did he say?
Well, he appealed to the UN to finally recognize the Palestinian people's right to self-determination, to have their own independent state.
A big shift in strategy there. Before that, the PLO had been mostly focused on condemning Israel, right?
Right. But this was different. It was about framing the conflict in terms of human rights.
Trying to get that international support.
Exactly. And it worked. To some extent. Arafat's speech, it got people talking. Okay, now, let's switch gears completely. Go to America.
Okay, I'm ready. What do we have?
November 13th, 1979. Ronald Reagan announces he's running for president.
Wow, Reagan. That would change everything.
Yeah. He came in promising lower taxes, less government, a strong military, and people listened.
He definitely tapped into something. His presidency had a huge impact domestically and also internationally.
No doubt about it. Now, here's something interesting. November 13th, 1990. You have two things happening that seem totally unrelated, but, well, they kind of highlight those opposing forces in history.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What are we talking about?
On the one hand, you have this attack on an Israeli camp, carried out by Sultan al-Jaluni. Just another reminder of that ongoing conflict.
Right, and on the other hand,
The first known web page is written.
no way. On the same day.
Same day. Tim Berners-Lee at CERN. The birth of the World Wide Web. I mean, talk about a game changer.
It makes you wonder, what if? What if those two events, that violence, that innovation, what if they had happened on different days? Would things be different? It's impossible to know, but it's an interesting thought.
Definitely. And it just shows you, I mean, November 13th, like any other day, I guess, it's full of these juxtapositions. Progress and conflict, destruction and creation, they all seem to happen side by side.
It's true, and that's what makes history so fascinating.
All right, so we've got conflict, we've got a little bit of hope for peace, and then, of course, there's always politics. November 13th has seen its fair share of political upheaval.
Let's hear it. What do we got?
Well, in 1995, there's a bombing in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia.
Targeted.
Yeah. It was a U.S.-run training center. 5 Americans were killed and 2 Indians. And the Islamic movement for reform claimed responsibility.
Right. They were trying to overthrow the Saudi monarchy.
Exactly. And this was one of the first major attacks on, well, Western interests in Saudi Arabia. A real turning point, I think.
Oh, absolutely. It showed just how far these extremist groups were willing to go. And it raised a lot of questions about Saudi Arabia's stability, as a key U.S. ally.
Yeah, it was a wake-up call in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And then a few years later, after 9/11, remember, President Bush, he takes a big step. November 13th, 2001, he authorizes those military tribunals for suspected terrorists.
Right. Very controversial. A lot of people felt it undermined due process, gave the government too much power.
Absolutely. But it was also a time of fear, trying to balance security with individual rights. It's never easy, especially after a tragedy like 9/11.
Yeah. Okay, what else do we have on the political front?
Well, let's go to 2008. We're in the Islamic Republic of Mauritania, and there's a coup. The president, Sidi Ould Sheikh Abdullahi, he's overthrown by the military. He was their first democratically elected leader, by the way.
Wow, so much for democracy.
It was a fragile democracy from the beginning. A lot of tension between the president and the military. Really makes you think about how easily those democratic institutions can be toppled.
Right, especially in regions where there's already so much instability.
Yeah. And then just a few years later, 2011, it's Italy's turn. They're in the middle of this huge financial crisis, and, well, Prime Minister Berlusconi, he's got to go.
Right. Not exactly a surprise. He was facing a lot of pressure. People had lost faith in his leadership.
So in comes Mario Monti, an economist, a former European commissioner.
Kind of a technocrat then.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They needed someone with expertise. It was a gamble for sure. But sometimes in those moments of crisis, you have to try something different.
Right. And sometimes you need someone who's not a politician to come in and shake things up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, now I want to talk about a moment of, well, maybe diplomacy is the right word. November 13th, 2017. So the Maronite patriarch, Mitar Boutros Rahi, he makes this historic visit to Saudi Arabia. First one in decades. And remember, the Maronite Church is an Eastern Catholic church.
Right. So you have the head of this Christian community visiting a predominantly Sunni Muslim country. Very interesting. What was the context?
Tensions were really high in the region at that time. But this visit, it was all about reconciliation, trying to build bridges.
And was it successful? Did it have any lasting impact?
It's hard to say for sure, but at the very least, it sent a message. It showed that dialogue was possible, even between groups that have, well, a lot of history.
Right. And for Saudi Arabia, it was a chance to present a more moderate image to the world, maybe even counter the influence of Iran in the region.
Exactly. It was a complex situation for sure. Okay, last one for the politics category, 2019. 2 events, same day, both highlighting those political shifts happening in the Arab world.
Okay, let's hear them.
First, Lebanon. Huge protests break out after President Aoun gives this, well, controversial speech.
What was it about?
Oh, it all started with a proposed tax on WhatsApp calls.
Wow. That's what sparked it.
That was the trigger. But it quickly became about, well, everything. Corruption, the economy, the political elite. People were just fed up.
Right. Sounds familiar.
It was a powerful reminder that, that people have a voice. And that sometimes you got to take to the streets to make that voice heard.
Absolutely. And what about the second event?
Okay, so Tunisia. Now, they're often seen as the the success story of the Arab Spring, right?
Right. They managed to transition to democracy relatively peacefully.
Right. And on this day, November 13th, 2019, Raj Ghannouchi, the leader of the Ennahda movement, he gets elected Speaker of Parliament.
So a moderate Islamist party now holds a key position in the government. How did people react to that?
Mixed reactions. Some saw it as a sign of democratic progress, former banned party now participating in the system.
Right.
But there were also concerns. Some people, especially secularists, they worried about, about an Islamist agenda.
It makes sense. It's a delicate balance.
It is. But both of these events, in Lebanon and Tunisia, they show that that the struggle for democracy, it's ongoing. It's never really finished.
Right, and that there's always going to be challenges, setbacks, different perspectives.
Yeah, and that's what makes it all so fascinating, right?
Absolutely. So much to unpack, so much to learn from.
Okay, so we've covered conflict, diplomacy, political upheaval. But November 13th isn't just about those big events. It's also about the people, the individuals whose lives were touched by these events or who made history themselves.
Right. The births and deaths that happen on this day, that's where things get really personal.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to explore next.
All right, so let's dive into these individual stories. Where do we start?
Let's start with births. And I think we got to talk about Augustine of Hippo, born on November 13th, 354 A.D., a giant in the world of theology and philosophy.
Absolutely. His writings had a huge influence on Christian thought, and they're still studied today.
Right. Like his Confessions. It's one of the first real autobiographies in Western literature, super personal, exploring his own spiritual journey. And it's just, it's a classic.
It is. Okay, so from deep theological thought, let's go to something a little lighter, adventure.
I like it. Let's talk about Robert Louis Stevenson.
Born November 13th, 1850.
The man who gave us Treasure Island. I mean, come on, who doesn't love a good pirate story?
A classic. I remember reading that as a kid and just being completely transported.
Me too. Okay, and then to round out our birth trifecta, we have to mention Whoopi Goldberg.
Born on November 13th, 1955.
Such a talent. Comedian, actress, talk show host, you name it.
And a trailblazer. I mean, as a Black woman in Hollywood, she broke so many barriers.
Absolutely. And she's always been outspoken, not afraid to tackle tough issues.
A true icon. Okay, so we've covered some notable births. What about deaths?
Well, we got to go back to 899 A.D. for this one. We have the death of Abu Muhammad ibn Qutayba al-Dinawari.
Okay, I'm not familiar with him. Tell me more.
So he was a polymath. Like, seriously. This guy knew everything. Literature, history, astronomy, math.
Wow. A true Renaissance man, way before the Renaissance.
Right? It's just amazing to think about the breadth of knowledge that people had, even back then.
It is. It makes you realize how much we've lost, in a way, that sense of interconnected knowledge.
I know what you mean. Okay, let's jump ahead a few centuries to 1868. This is when we lose Gioacchino Rossini.
Ah, the composer.
The one and only, known for his operas, like The Barber of Seville.
A classic. I mean, that overture, it's so recognizable. It just makes you happy.
I know. It's like instantly puts you in a good mood. Okay, and then for our final death on this November 13th journey, we have a more recent one.
Okay, who are we talking about?
Eddie Guerrero.
The wrestler.
Yeah. He died in 2005. And he was a legend in the world of professional wrestling. So much charisma, so much talent.
Right. And he had a really interesting story. He struggled with addiction, but he came back. He was really open about his struggles.
He connected with people on a deep level. It was a real tragedy when he died so young.
It was. Okay, so we've talked about saints and pirates, comedians and composers, even wrestlers. November 13th really has seen it all, hasn't it?
It really has. It's a good reminder that history is, it's about people. It's about their lives, their stories.
And their legacies, how those stories continue to resonate even after they're gone.
Exactly. And it makes you think, what stories from our own time will be remembered?
Right. Which events will be seen as turning points? It's impossible to know for sure.
That's the mystery of history, I guess. But it's exciting to think about. Okay, so we've explored so much today. Conflict, peacemaking, politics, and now these individual stories. What do you think? Are there any overarching themes that emerge from November 13th?
Well, one thing that strikes me is this constant interplay between continuity and change. We see those age-old patterns of conflict and power struggles repeating themselves. But at the same time, there's also this drive for progress, for innovation, for finding new ways to connect with each other.
Yeah, it's like we're always trying to move forward, but we're also kind of, dragging that baggage of the past along with us.
Exactly. And that's what makes history so complex, so fascinating. It's not just a linear progression. It's more like, a spiral. We keep coming back to these same issues, but maybe, hopefully, each time we're a little bit wiser.
I like that, a spiral. So what do we do with that wisdom? I mean, what's the takeaway here? Why does any of this matter?
That's the big question, isn't it? I think for me, it's about recognizing that history isn't just something that happened in the past. It's a living force that shapes our present, and it will continue to shape the future.
Right. So we have to learn from it, both the good and the bad.
Exactly. We have to be aware of those patterns, those cycles of conflict and progress. And then we have to make conscious choices about how we want to contribute to the story that's still being written.
I love that. Okay, so one last thought for our listeners. As we go about our daily lives, let's all try to be a little more mindful of the history that surrounds us.
Yeah, look for those connections, those echoes of the past and the present. And think about what kind of future we want to create.
Beautifully said. And on that note, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep making history. You know, it's amazing when you step back and look at everything we've talked about, all these events, all these people spanning centuries, it really hits you just how connected it all is.
It really is. Like we're seeing these threads weaving together, forming this, well, this intricate tapestry.
Exactly. And each thread, no matter how small, it contributes to the overall picture.
And some of those threads, they represent individual lives that get caught up in those larger historical currents. Like take Augustine of Hippo, for example.
Right, born in 354.
Right. His ideas about, well, about grace, free will, the nature of God, they had a huge impact, not just on religious doctrine, but on politics, art, you name it. It's incredible.
It really is. Just one person's idea is having this ripple effect across time and space. But then, on the flip side, you have people whose lives were directly impacted by, well, by the events of their time.
Right, like those who lived through the St. Bryce's Day massacre or the Battle of Simu in 1966. Imagine living through something like that. It becomes part of you.
It shapes who you are, it shapes how you see the world, and it becomes part of the historical record, too.
Exactly. And it reminds us that history isn't just about, dates and battles and treaties. It's about people, their experiences, their hopes and fears.
And their stories. November 13th has seen so many stories unfold, stories of incredible courage and resilience.
And stories of, well, of unimaginable cruelty and loss.
It's that mix of light and darkness that makes history so compelling, so human.
So real. And it makes you realize that, well, that we're all part of this ongoing story. And the choices we make today, they'll have consequences. They'll ripple out, maybe in ways we can't even imagine.
That's a powerful thought. So as we wrap up this deep dive into November 13th, I want to leave our listeners with one final takeaway.
Okay, I'm listening.
Let's try to be more aware of the history that surrounds us in our everyday lives.
Yes. Look for those connections. Think about the people who came before us, what they experienced, what they achieved, what they struggled with.
Exactly. And use that knowledge, that awareness, to make informed choices about the kind of future we want to create.
Because ultimately, we're all history makers, whether we realize it or not.
Well said. And on that note, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll see you next time, ready to explore more fascinating corners of the past, and maybe even glimpse a bit of the future